Welcome to Trauma Symptoms Module, age 6 to 21, Cairns, New York, for Health Home Serving Children. This is a Lunch and Learn webinar, a 1-hour presentation sort of designed to reinforce some of your skills and knowledge directly related to the Trauma Symptoms Module. We want to specifically cover, provide some rating practice through a mini vignette and specifically cover some of the nuances of this particular module. Thank you, Cynthia, for doing that. I'll switch that over right now to Mr. Nellist. So again, thank you guys for being here. Introductions very quickly. My name is Brandon Howlett, and I work at the University of Kentucky, the Center for Innovation and Population Health. I work specifically with the Cairns, New York Technical Assistance Institute, providing a lot of things. Amongst those things is resources, tips, tricks, all directly related to the Cairns, New York, the tools and implementation and practice of the tools. And so I've been fortunate enough to have used the tool in the field in a former career, care management, case management, basically interfacing with human beings out in the field. And I used the tool for probably close to a decade and a half. And there have been some iterations of the tool and some progressive changes to the tool, but all in all, it's still a TCOM tool. And so I typically like to share my experiences as they're relevant to the subject matter. And so I'll do that today as well. I definitely want to hear from you all about your experiences with the tool and, specifically with regard to this module, the Trauma Symptoms module, what you think about it, how you've been able to use it, etc. If you can, we will be using, obviously, a web-based platform. So there are some sort of tech things to look out for. By show of the chat box, we're going to be using the chat box this afternoon. Have you ever taken a Zoom training with us or with anyone else for that matter? Experience with Zoom. Excellent. Some yeses coming in. Okay, so based upon the answers that are coming in right now, obviously, many of us have experience with Erica, thank you. And so we could drop the call this afternoon. If the call drops on my end, don't run away. We'll get it back up and running and we'll get you situated. We'll keep moving forward. If the call drops for you, don't fret. We have myself as well as some of our Cairns Institute staff, some coaches and some leads on this call. They'll sort of hang out until I can get myself signed back in. I'm going to knock on wood because I'm hoping that does not happen. So if you have any questions, concerns, thoughts, or ideas, feel free to place that into the chat box or unmute yourself. This seems to work a little bit better when we have a face-to-face connection with one another. I see this as a conversation more so than a presentation. So please, please, please make yourself actively invested and involved in the process. And I think it'd be a really cool conversation to have. Let's see if I covered any. Oh, last thing. By way of the chat box again, please type in your position. If you're care manager, write CM. If you're care manager supervisor, CMS. If it's other, just write other and sort of give me an indication as to what it is that you do. This will help me sort of shape the conversation within the context of the work that you do. I think it's really important to be able to, get some of the information from a lens in which you're familiar. So we'll do that. As that's coming in, okay, bilingual care manager. I like that. Thank you, Ashley, for sharing that. There are going to be some nuances to this that I think that you can probably surface some questions about being a bilingual care manager. A lot of care managers, supervisors, a couple of our coaching staff here. So we have a great audience. I'm looking forward to the conversation. Let's talk about our learning objectives for this afternoon. We want to do a couple different things. We've established some presentation objectives that will help to guide our discussion this afternoon. So we want to have an in-depth conversation about highlighting some of the obstacles that the Cairns, New York users have across the state, or some of the obstacles that you might encounter in the future. In addition to that, we'd like to demonstrate some strategies that might be helpful in sidestepping some of the identified barriers when rating this module. And lastly, we want to engage in a guided discussion with a case example. Later on, we'll do case example, pretty simple one, a youngster named Monica, and we'll explore and practice some of the strategies that we discussed throughout this afternoon. So in the chat box, if you could, please share what some of your learning goals for this afternoon are. What are you hoping to get from our discussion today? What are you hoping to get out of today's discussion? As you guys type that in, I'll just make note that as we progress through the presentation today, it's important that you share your ideas about the subject matter, that you engage in the conversation, and the more that you participate in the conversation, the more robust and meaningful the presentation will be for our entire audience. Amanda says, to better understand the trauma module and ratings. How to rate the trauma module. Okay, excellent. Yeah, so that's what we're looking to do. We're looking to have the conversation about how you might rate this module and some of the pitfalls and things to sort of sidestep, and some of the connections, the interconnected nature of this particular module with some of the other domains and modules within the tool. So that's what we're going to discuss. What items are rated in this module? Do we remember what items are rated in this module? Can you type in or say some of the items that you remember from this module? I did email the 6 to 21 reference guide to everyone. What are some of the items that you remember from this module? Don't be shy. Absolutely. Traumatic grief. Give me one more. We'll move forward. We'll take a peek at it. Hyperarousal, affective physiological dysregulation, and numbing. Absolutely. So there are 7 items in this module for ages 6 to 21. They're directly related to a person's experience to complex trauma. What is complex trauma? Complex trauma can be defined as an experience of multiple traumatic events that are often interpersonal. These experiences, these interpersonal traumatic experiences might impact the ways in which a person sort of sees the world. It can be incredibly severe, they can be ongoing, and they can be cumulative in nature. You'll notice that the definition, the description that I just gave you to complex trauma is a description that specifically highlights the impact, right? So that's what we're looking at in this particular module, the impact. The impact of repeated interpersonal trauma, so complex trauma, can do a number of different things. It can affect a person's ability to build relationships, attach to other people, form close personal relationships, intimate relationships. It can impact how a person, their defense mechanisms, whether or not they're sort of numbing or isolating or avoiding other people. It can impact a person's sense of safety and security. Just think about some of the things that we may have seen in some of the kids that we work with that could be defense mechanisms, but are sort of interpreted as something otherwise. All right, so our conversation, really want you to think about what it is that you could be seeing. Complex trauma can impact brain development, the development of the nervous system. It can impact physical responses to environments, body's responses, physical responses, responses to events or stressors or people. Can impact the emotional response as well. Emotional responses to all of the aforementioned arenas and areas. Can impact behavior, especially in our younger clients, our younger members. I think about triggers, triggers to certain words even. Can impact cognitive functioning, thoughts, decision-making. So when you look at the trauma symptoms module, what we should see are examples of ways repeated interpersonal trauma might impact the youth's functioning. Okay. Make sure we get that one on mute. Right there. Got it. Mute. Okay. So you also want to keep in mind within the tool, there might be some impacts based upon an adverse childhood experience. So ACEs, we're all familiar with ACEs, right? For example, child functioning items such as peer interactions, right? So there might be connections on the tool that sort of mirror one another, but don't have the same intended impact or the same intended purpose on the tool. So again, I'll look at childhood experiences as well, child functioning items, peer interactions, decision-making and judgment, or items from the behavioral health module. For example, emotional control or anxiety. So those items can have a connection to a person's trauma experiences. But the difference between those items and the items in the trauma symptoms module is the explicit connection between the symptoms and the trauma experiences. So when rating these items in this module, the rater, yourself, you're looking to communicate that there's a known connection between the traumatic experience and the behaviors or symptoms associated with the items in the module, right? So I'll give you an example of what I'm trying to convey here. I'll go back a step. So when you're looking at peer interactions, that's not in this particular module. A person could have an actionable rating for peer interactions that are directly related to trauma, but they don't have to, right? They don't have to have that. And so, that domain doesn't have a link or interconnection to a person's trauma, but this one does. We're specifically looking at things that could be associated to a trauma experience, okay? Re-experiencing, Max says, absolutely. Questions and thoughts before we move to our next slide. I wanted to make sure that we sort of understood what items are rated in this module and why we rate them, or the lens in which we want to rate them. Questions? Don't be shy. Okay, we shall move forward. So why focus on this particular module? So we created this Lunch and Learn on this particular module to acknowledge the experience for care managers and to offer strategies to support accurate and efficient ratings of these items. Through the years, we've had conversations in person with folks in training venues and training platforms. We've had conversations with people who say, well, this module is a little bit difficult for me to understand. The fact of the matter is, not everyone's going to have a clinical background. Not everyone's going to have a clinical take or experience sort of evaluating and understanding, a trauma-informed lens. Okay, so we wanted to make it a little bit easier to sort of navigate that world and also encourage you to reach out to other folks if necessary when rating this module. Okay, what we know is that items in this module can be incredibly challenging for folks. The items in this module may not be things that you're sort of rating independently, right? Meaning you don't have to know all of the answers. We should rely on multiple sources, multiple people, the experts in the field, if you will, to inform not only the ratings, but also the interventions that are directly related to those ratings in this module, right? So there should be some connection, some congruence between the trauma experiences that we've identified, the actionable ratings for this module, and then the interventions that are put in place based upon what we've identified. Okay, so while some symptoms are uncommon, some symptoms might be uncommon, there's still a need for that connection. So when rating these items in this module, and things are actionable, we're communicating that action should include a trauma-informed intervention. So the National Child Traumatic Stress Network lists a bunch of interventions on their website as being appropriate for youth with effects of complex trauma. I'll go through a couple of them. Attachment, self-regulation, and competence, so that's ARC. Integrative treatment of complex trauma, so in adolescents, ITCT-A. And feel free to add some of these trauma-informed interventions if you know of them and I haven't sort of rattled them off. We're looking at real life heroes, which is something that's used at my former agency, well, it used to be used at my former agency pretty heavily. And then there's strengthening family coping resources, so SFCR, just to name a few. So we want to make sure that we have an understanding that the ratings in this area are directly connected to trauma experiences as well as trauma-based interventions. They should be. I'm going to put a couple of links into the chat box at the end of our session today. about 6 or 7 different links that I think might be, actually, you know what? I'll do it right now because I think that with me sort of being conscious of our time this afternoon, I want to make sure you have all of the tools and resources to be successful with this module. By the way, while I'm looking for this, feel free to ask, while I'm grabbing these links for you, feel free to sort of pepper me with some of your questions as I put these resources into the chat box. Really useful resources. A lot of this stuff, if not all of it, is based upon evidence-based practices, evidence-based research. So it's not just sort of like willy-nilly things that we're putting together for you. And again, these are separate links that could be of assistance to you. All right, so there you go with those links. Questions before we move forward? So again, some of these links are explanations and resources for understanding complex trauma, what it is, how it works, as well as resources on the effects of trauma and trauma-based interventions as well. So let's talk about the common challenges of completing the CANS, the trauma symptoms module for 6 to 21. Some of the challenges involved in that are, can you all see my screen, my slide? Should be a title slide. Okay, thank you, Max. I see you shaking your head. Has anyone on our call today ever had any issues or struggles with rating this module? You can type that in the chat box or feel free to talk to me. Let's have a convo. Feel free to talk. Yes. What are some of those issues or struggles that you might have had? Some of the challenges that you might have had with this particular module? Eddie, what are some of the struggles that you've had with this module? Anyone else want to sort of throw in the hat? Issues, challenges, struggles that we might have had with this, rating this module, 6 to 21. It's not always so clear what ratings are asking. Yes, so we'll cover that. We'll cover that at some point. Max, did you? It looks like you were going to say something there.
A challenge that I have frequently is relating ratings on the trauma system, on the trauma module to inadequate client history, family history, kids. You know, end up with what really looks like and seems like it should be trauma, but denial of any history of trauma or evidence of trauma specifically. So relating that history to ratings and the trauma is something I see often.
Absolutely, and I think that more seasoned folks are, and the more they use the tool, they'll probably have similar observations. It came up this morning on the same exact lunch and learn with a different group. And sort of the idea was, well, it's hard to connect the dots without the actual history. And so in those situations, I'm sure you know this already, Max, you want to really have conversations with folks and sort of dig into that history, look for things that stand out, that don't make as much sense as it should, and stick to your instincts, ask questions. I see another one that says it's some topics are similar to behavioral health section, so there could be some crossover because we're talking in this module. We're talking about behaviors and potential. Actually, let me rephrase that. We're talking about trauma experiences and potential responses to those trauma experiences that could manifest as behaviors. And so naturally, there could be some crossover from our interpretation about what it is that we're looking at. So I think that's a very, Megan, thank you for sharing that. So the 3 common challenges that we're going to discuss in detail today are gaining comfort using the trauma-informed lens. What is the trauma-informed lens? Why we should be using it and how to get comfortable using it. The second one is items, the fact that items in this module we're not always familiar with them as in the same vein that we're familiar with other items within other domains. For example, you might have a better understanding right out the gate about danger to others and what that might look like for a kid versus hyperarousal or numbing. All right, so we're not always as familiar. The one that sort of stands out, I think, for a lot of folks in terms of not being familiar with it is affective physiological dysregulation, right? So that one is you got to do some digging in order to figure out what it is that the item is looking for. The third and final challenge that we'll discuss today is gathering evidence to guide the ratings for these items. And so that's sort of what Max was talking about with regard to history. If the history is no, that's not an issue, it's never been an issue, then how do you sort of gather evidence to suggest what it is that the team is seeing now? Like, obviously you want to use fresh, relevant information based on what folks are seeing right now. But in some cases, there might be, historical references to what it is that you're seeing. How do you surface that? Obviously, if a kid has a bunch of ratings for exposure to traumatic or adverse experiences, that ACEs section on the cans, then there should be some congruence down the line regarding screening questions and to some degree screening questions, but more so the trauma symptoms modules. Okay, so let's jump into these three obstacles or challenges that we've identified and sort of flesh them out a little bit more. Before we do that, we're going to talk about what a trauma-informed lens is. The first thing is sort of a trauma-informed lens is simply understanding the connection between what it is that you're seeing and the experience that someone has lived. So this could be really wearing the glasses and looking at a circumstance and saying, well, maybe this kid isn't a bad kid. Maybe something really bad happened to this kid to promote this kind of a behavior or to propel this kind of a behavior. It's very similar to understanding what's happening below the surface. Think about the movie Titanic. The ship hits the iceberg. More often than not, the iceberg below the surface is much greater, much grander, much bigger than the iceberg above the water. And so it's taking a peek behind the curtain a little bit and trying to figure out if what it is that you're seeing is an outward projection because of a circumstance right now, or if it's directly related to a trauma experience. Real quick story I'll share with you to make the point on what a trauma-informed lens is, and then we'll move forward. Worked with this young man who would soil his pants. He would poop his pants in school whenever he was sort of upset. And so the school staff took this as an outward behavior to challenge authority. And so this kid was in detention. He was he was reprimanded. He was sort of moved around the schoolhouse and the meetings with the caregiver. And so to some degree, there was a level of a punitive approach based upon this kid's choices. No one ever made the connection that something else could be going on. I worked directly with this kid, and so I started with the trauma-informed lens. I started to ask, okay, is there something else happening with this? I did my homework, did my research on the case. I started, looking into the paperwork for this kid from a different region of the state of New York. He moved to my region of the state from a different region of the state, and so I was able to surface that this kid had a history of some sexual abuse. He was, a victim, and when I was able to break the ice enough, we had the conversation, and he said, yeah, well, I poop my pants because I know that people aren't going to take advantage of me. If I smell, no one's going to want to be around me. And so, that's what I do. That's my thing. Get away from me. I poop my pants. And so looking at that situation, that's a defense mechanism for this kid. That's a way to keep himself safe, right? Safety and security is a primary tenet of our general well-being. And so that's what he would do to keep himself safe. Directly related to a trauma experience. And so, on one end, he's being punished by the school for his reaction to what's happening at school, using the tools in his toolbox, his coping mechanisms. And they didn't necessarily see it from a trauma-informed lens. So we want care managers to be able to look below the surface and understand that what you are seeing might not necessarily be what it is that you think you're seeing. So basically, we're saying do your homework, talk to other folks, research things, if you will. So this first challenge, right? So give you some idea of what we gave you some idea of what a trauma-informed lens is. So how do we use it? What does it look like? So a common observation for a lot of our CANS coaches and some of our CANS leads is that sometimes raters will forget to look at the youth's documented behaviors and the potential that their responses to a trauma experience. Very similarly to the scenario that I just gave you. You want to make sure that you're looking into the stuff that's written down and questioning, is this a response to an experience or is this something else? Secondarily, when working with youth that we know have experienced trauma, it's going to be beneficial for care managers to help the team to reframe the conversation about the youth's behavior. Instead of that negative aspect, right? Instead of that bad kid perspective, maybe you reframe that and say something else. It's not a bad kid. Maybe you say something like this. Given what we know has happened to this kid, what's happened in this kid's life, I think that these behaviors may be understood with those experiences in mind, right? And so getting people on the same page might be imperative to your success in that collaborative effort, that convergence of the minds to get to a level of wellness that is necessary for our kids to graduate and move forward. So taking trauma and informed approach can enhance not only your understanding, but the people around you in terms of what might be going on for that youth, what's working for that person on an emotional level, what's not. It can inform potential pathways to their wellness, right? You're armed with some insight, can prevent teams from making statements about the kid's character or shifting focus to understanding some of the behaviors as reactions, right? Again, the intent is to create safety and security without necessarily having to put that young person in the position to use their tools to do the same thing. So if I could inform the school about my kid who poops his pants, he doesn't necessarily have to do that anymore because now the school is aware. Give him space, right? We're going to approach it a little bit differently. So we want you to use that lens and have the conversations with folks about using that lens. So since the trauma symptoms module is focused on connecting trauma experiences with symptoms and functioning, there are a couple of different things that we have to remember. Remember, our assessment of the trauma and the way that it impacts starts from the adverse childhood experiences, the ACEs domain. There's a direct pathway. These things, think about them as links of a chain, right? So the adverse childhood experiences is informing a lot of stuff thereafter, particularly with this module. And I know, Max, you've done some work in this area, and I know that your sister's done some work in this area when you're sort of looking at the congruence between the pathways, right? And so I think it's important in general. I don't think the care managers realize that some of these modules and some of these domains are interconnected in this way. By the way, if you have questions at any point, please feel free to ask those questions. I understand that we're sort of covering a lot of stuff at a pretty decent pace. So I will slow down if you have questions that are directly related to the content or other questions. And so the ACEs section should give you some insight about trauma and also trigger some of your thoughts and your conversations with regard to the screening questions ratings. Now, we know that if you answer a 1, 2, or a 3 on the screening questions, that's going to open up a module, an extension module, for whatever it was that you were rating in the screening questions module. For the sake of time and example, we're going to stick with trauma symptoms. Let's say you rate a 1, 2, or 3 in the screening questions for something directly related to trauma. That's going to open up the trauma symptoms module. Okay, so these 3 sections, I'll say them one more time, we'll move forward. Advanced childhood experiences domain, trauma symptom screening questions, and the trauma and symptoms module is interconnected, and understanding their relationship to one another can be very, very helpful for care managers when rating the items in the trauma symptoms module. Megan says some topics are similar to behavioral health section. So, I would say if you're looking at topics, some of the items that you feel are similar to the behavioral health section, go ahead and take a peek at those anchor definitions, right? You can hash out where the differences lie. But ultimately, if you look at it from a holistic approach, there could be some similarities, because in the behavioral health module, you're talking about someone's actions, and those actions could be directly related to their trauma experiences. So there could be some things that are interconnected here. That's not like something that's intended to sort of trip folks up. We want folks to know that the understand the interconnected nature of the modules as well as the items that they're working on. So very good insight. Other questions, other comments, concerns, ideas before we move on to our next challenge? Okay, so let's get a little bit more familiar with the items in the module. Given that some of these issues are less common in our work, let's take some time to review in more detail what some of these items might look like and what some of this information is. You may have noticed the definitions and the anchor descriptions within the reference guide in the trauma symptoms module can be kind of lengthy and sometimes a little bit confusing. I think about 84G when we have this conversation. 84G is super long. It was written to sort of highlight certain aspects of a kid's life, but there's a lot in there. So when learning the CANS New York for the first time in particular, this domain can be kind of intimidating. Since some of the items are less common, we also may sort of have had experiences working with youth that present symptoms or present other behaviors that have some crossover, as Megan sort of mentioned earlier. But when we're thinking about their trauma experiences, without those experiences and without our knowledge of those experiences, it can be difficult to develop an understanding of the items in the same way that we would understand some of the more common items like depression or substance use, right? So we understand the deep-rooted nuances of depression and what that looks like more so in those areas than we might understand what traumatic grief is. And I'll use another example about traumatic grief. On the surface, just looking at traumatic grief, you might think, okay, I have a really good idea of what it is that we're looking at. But then you read the anchor definition about what the item is trying to capture, you realize that there's a direct connection between loss, death, or separation. Those are all, in many people's opinions, if not all, adverse experiences. And so how are those experiences, if at all, impacting a person's situation or life? Okay, let's turn to page 21 in the reference guide if you have it handy. Page 21 in the reference guide. If you don't have it handy, then I will share screen and bring that up. And so I'll do that now. Share screen. Where'd it go? Looks like we're not there yet. There we go. Share screen right there. Okay. So a lot going on here, right? If you're looking at traumatic grief, right? Let's read that language. Can you all still see my screen? I just had to move it. Can you still see the reference guide? Give me a thumbs up if you can. Yes. All right. So traumatic grief. This item refers to grief of a child, grief a child may experience as a result of a death, separation from significant caregivers, siblings, or other important figures. And so this might be a little bit easier to understand for most folks, but I tell you, it's been a challenge when we get to dissociation and affective or physiological dysregulation. This item refers to a cluster of symptoms often seen among children who have experienced complex chronic and interpersonal trauma. This child often demonstrates difficulty identifying, describing, regulating internal emotion states. And so I'm making the point that sometimes it can be a little bit more difficult for folks to break that down. It's not the easiest language to sort of understand. Have we experienced any issues or any items that we want to highlight? Are there any items that you all would like to highlight with regard to the reference guide? Now, I know some folks are care manager supervisors. Are there any areas in particular that your care managers, in terms of these 7 items, are there any items that they may have struggled with? So I'm getting the impression that all of your staff are incredibly familiar with all 7 of these items. If that's not the case, then challenge me. Numbing, okay. Dissociation. Give me a little bit more. What has been the trend that you're seeing with dissociation?
Brandon, so I'm coming on to talk. So I think it goes back to something you said about the clinical language. What I've noticed is a lot of the care managers, especially if the care manager is like fresh from like coming out from their bachelor's in school and they don't have a lot of experience, these terminologies kind of get lost. And the explanation, like you're talking about, it can be a little heavy to understand. And also connecting it with, I see it, I read and I understand what it says, but how do I actually see this? How do I decode it when I'm actually in front of a person talking about it? And if they're denying these things, what are signs that can tell me, or the evidence that I need to look for to actually tell me that no, there is evidence for numbing and dissociation or any of the other items in that trauma module?
Absolutely. Very good feedback. I appreciate that. Other thoughts? It's a great way to frame it. So, after you sort of get your care managers oriented or get yourself oriented with the item, the anchor language, as well as the descriptions and definitions, and thinking about all of the examples that you can sort of drum up to make it easier to understand, we still might feel like we need more information. So it's always helpful to seek out additional information about the items. It's always helpful to seek out additional information about how those items might be, how those items might be playing out for a particular client. Additional information about the items included in the trauma symptoms module can be found at the National Child Traumatic Stress Network's website, which is one of the links that I placed into the chat box about 15 minutes ago for you guys. Again, we're going to share all of the resources that we have at our disposal to make sure that you guys are successful with regard to navigating this module. It's not the easiest one to navigate, hence our lunch and learn on the topic. Our third and final challenge that we see folks sort of grappling with is using evidence to guide their ratings. Using evidence to guide the ratings. So you want to use evidence to guide all of your ratings, and I think that it's easier to do. It's easier to sort of see the evidence in some modules and domains more so than in this one. So like all items on the canvas, you want to use the needs action levels for this module. We want to use evidence when we're rating an item as actionable, so a 2 or a 3. So how might gathering evidence for trauma symptoms module be different from gathering evidence for other domains and modules? How might that be different? Not a rhetorical question. How might it be different from your perspective? You could even answer that from a practical lens. What do you do differently to gather evidence for this module than any other module or items? Are we using the tool in practice at all? Okay, I see some posture changes. I'm hoping that means folks are ready to sort of. So again, what does gathering evidence look like for the items in this domain? Somebody take a stab at it.
Brandon, I put in the chat looking more at the past history.
Absolutely.
Of that child, yeah.
Absolutely. So looking at the history is important. And I think that Max also sort of identified what that could look like, right, in terms of what's reported. History is incredibly important. So when rating, you want to make sure, when rating, it's helpful to rely on more than just one observation. You want to use the people around, the collateral contacts and natural supports. Use multiple sources of information, families, caregivers, neighbors, if that's appropriate and you have consent to do so. Professional supports, teachers, principals, etc. You want to cast a wide net when gathering information, and it can help you. It could help your development and understanding of what it is that you're seeing in front of you. The second thing that I would sort of give you advice for when sticking to evidence to sort of justify your ratings. Your service provision array that might be able to help you. I see a lot of Me Too's. Yep. Trying to see if my stuff's coming in late or if those are actually current. Oh yeah, I have a slight delay. I didn't know that. I'm just getting comments that were coming in earlier, so that's good to know. Where possible, you want to use the opinions of those professional experts and never feel like you have to have all of the answers. Am I breaking up for you guys? No? Okay, I just got your internet is unstable. If you're ever unsure about what's happening and what information you have, the information that you have, gather additional information in order to accurately and efficiently get to the ratings. The rating of a 1 communicates that you're still gathering information before deciding on whether or not action should be taken. Okay, so in this module, a 1, you want to really be sort of checking your work to make sure you got everything. And so some strategies for success. Again, okay, I guess I was breaking up a little bit. You want to use folks that are around you, okay? Reconstructing these questions for better understanding can also be helpful. Erica, can you tell us a little bit more about, elaborate a little bit on that?
Yes, hi, can you hear me?
Absolutely.
Yes, sometimes I notice when I'm discussing the CANS questions with certain maybe guardians or parents, it's hard for them to understand exactly what it is that I'm asking. One particular question would be, especially with younger children, because that is mostly our demographic, when we ask about maybe the sexual aggression or anything of that sort, some parents I've noticed they immediately get very defensive. What do you mean? My child is only 10 or 11, and I'm just asking. Let me rephrase this question. Have you ever seen any of this or that? And that helps them. Oh, okay, I understand now. And that kind of eases them, because it just putting the 3-letter word sex in the same sentence as a 11 or a 12-year-old, to a parent, and directing this to a parent, it can also be very sensitive to them. So reconstructing some of these questions can help and help the parent better understand, and help the care manager get a better answer than as opposed to wait, what are you talking about?
Absolutely. That is something that I would absolutely encourage care managers to do. Reframe the questions, rephrase the questions in a way that's appropriate for the audience that's receiving the questions. And when I say appropriate, I'm directly referring to their experiences. This is imperative in the engagement building process, right? This is the engagement is close to the front door of services. And so they get through the threshold and we're engaging, we're building credibility, we're building trust. And so those are some techniques that will be helpful along the way. By the way, if you haven't done so already, please check out our engagement training. that gives some tips and tricks on how to do that. But Erica, when you mentioned that, as well as Dr. Arabelis Hidalgo, I sort of thought about how you might sort of use language, right, that doesn't trigger someone, or as written, open up a can of worms, right? You have to be strategic in your approach. You have to be strategic in your disclosures sometimes about what it is the item is looking for, which is another cool thing about the cans is you don't have to start or stay in any particular area or item, right? You could start working in the trauma symptoms module in the beginning of the meeting and realize, wow, this probably wasn't a good idea. Let's jump somewhere else and come back to this later. And to further that point, you don't have to do everything in one shot, okay? However, it's important to remember that the youth's past experience, whether they're adverse or not, have a great potential to impact their thoughts as well as their feelings and their actions. I think of the cognitive triangle. Some folks may be familiar with it, that the things that you think about can impact how you feel, and how you feel might impact what it is that you do. So before approaching this module, do a little bit of homework, have those conversations, do a little bit of digging. Make sure that you know as much as possible about that person's history, and verify your understanding of what it is that you think you know. Because a lot of times, I've been in situations where, hey, I understand that you've gone through this, and a person might say, well, that's not how, I never went through that. And so verify your understanding of their circumstances and their history. Knowing their experiences will help you to make connections to their current functioning and any current obstacles related to their function. It's going to serve care managers very well to sort of build their own skills and understanding of the trauma symptoms module by carefully reviewing the sources of information from trauma experts and folks in our industry. Always rate based on facts that you've observed. This is an area that you want specific evidence to highlight action. Keep in mind that ratings translate into action, and that all those actions should be based on things that are either documented or seen. Questions? Any thoughts, ideas, suggestions, etc.?
One thing I think is helpful when addressing some of these, I would say, touchy subjects, is after it is addressed, to also acknowledge the accomplishment. As we discussed before, some of these questions can pose as a trigger. So if you're able to get the person to talk about that situation, and understanding that it could possibly be a trigger, but they're still able to talk about it, they're still able to address it in order to help get a better rating on the cans after they're done discussing. One thing I like to do is, first of all, I'd like to acknowledge, thank you so much for opening up about that. I know that couldn't be easy, or I know that was something probably really tough for you, and I just want to be able to congratulate you on taking that step. I really appreciate you being honest and open, and just acknowledging that step that they take, because even that small little bit of acknowledgement can probably open up a world of trust between you and that client moving forward.
Absolutely. And again, you don't get to that point without building some rapport with a family. And so I guess it's just as important to build that trust and credibility as it is to sort of do any other homework that's related to success with this tool. Any other questions or thoughts? Thank you for sharing that, Erica. That's a very good point. Any other thoughts before we move on? All right, so we're going to move on. We're going to practice with a guided discussion. We're going to work through some of these concepts, specifically the interconnectivity of the different domains and modules, specifically around trauma. So let's take a peek at Monica. You guys can follow along with Monica. Okay. Monica is 11 years old and has 3 brothers that range in age from 3 to 9 years old. All 4 children were left with a neighbor while mom went to work, or while mom went out. Monica's mom has been involved with some bad people from the streets, as described by Monica. Her mom was expected to return within an hour. The neighbor kept the children for 5 days before contacting Child Protective Services. Monica reports that she worries about her mom and if or when she's going to return. Monica reports that she has nightmares about her mom not returning, and she gets startled at night, causing her to wake up when she hears a noise because she thinks it's her mom coming to get her and her brothers. She rarely sleeps, has diminished appetite, and is now withdrawing from her siblings. All right, so a lot going on with Monica. All right, so thinking about Monica's situation, the Monica that you see right in front of you, does the mini vignette indicate any adverse experiences in Monica's life? If so, then what? Does the vignette indicate any adverse life experiences for Monica?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, Erica.
I
What?
think one thing that stands out the most to me is the change in caregiver. I know that this is mentioned, even though it's not specified that Monica was placed just for the idea of staying there. They were there for some time, and then after that, being put into Child Protective Services. So that's another change in caregiver, and so that in itself is already an adverse situation in the household.
Absolutely. That's a huge red flag. That disruption in caregiving could cascade into a number of different things, right? So I would agree with that. Disruption in caregiving. That is item number 79. Item 79, disruption in caregiver giving is item 79 in the ACEs module. So let me ask you this. Does Monica's trauma symptoms impact her daily functioning at all? Okay, they impact her daily functioning. Okay, how? What items in the trauma symptoms module might we address in rating and subsequently care planning for Monica? We've identified, okay, numbing. Anything else? What items in the trauma symptoms module? Traumatic grief, okay. Anything else? I would say probably hyperarousal. So let's take a step back for a second. Monica's situation, there's a lot happening. We answered yes to the question of whether or not she's had any adverse experiences. So that's the ACEs. That's the ACEs section of the CANS, the ACEs domain. All right. So we answered yes. Disruption in caregiving. That's going to impact the trauma screening questions. Right? And would typically open up the trauma symptoms module. We asked, do her trauma symptoms impact her daily functioning? Absolutely, they impact her daily functioning. She's not sleeping, she's having nightmares, she's having issues with her appetite. So I think we would rate in the trauma symptoms module. We've identified at least 2 items that we would rate in that trauma symptoms module: traumatic grief, as well as hyperarousal. So I want to highlight the interconnectivity of these 3 sections of the CANS. There's a direct pathway between ACEs, screening questions, and trauma symptoms. Just ask the questions in the way that we just did. We just jumped from disruption in caregiving to screening questions to evidence of action, at least the 2, for traumatic grief. The evidence is her separation, the nightmares, and the withdrawal. We have evidence to support action, a 2 or a 3. In this case, I would probably rate a 2 for hyperarousal as well. She's worried, she's startled, and she has a diminished appetite. And so we've used the evidence that's right in front of us about her functioning and about her trauma experiences to inform our ratings for action. Questions, thoughts, ideas? Believe it or not, we're in the home stretch. We only have about 5 minutes left, but I want to hear what your thoughts are. Want to close this out with a, conversation if we can. Or perhaps a challenge, I don't whatever it is that you guys want to do.
So is a connection between an ACE and trauma symptoms absolutely essential? If a kid is exhibiting what looks like night terror, waking up at night, but there's just no evidence of an ACE, is re-experiencing or hyperarousal ruled out?
I would say no. I would say at the very least, Max, you have a circumstance where you have at least a 1, right? And you're exploring. That 1 is going to mean you're going to ask questions. Right now, we can't ask any question. We can't ask Monica any questions. But if Monica were a real kid in a real world, and you had some thoughts about other aspects that might be impacting that kid, that might be illustrated by the items that we're exploring, I would certainly say have those conversations, right? You want to bring in the people that might have the ability to sort of speak to what it is that you're questioning.
But if it's not confirmed, it's ruled out as an actionable item then? I mean, if a kid waking
If you don't have evidence to support the action, then I would say yes.
Okay.
Right? It doesn't mean you throw it away. Doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. It means you're going to Sherlock Holmes it. you're going to get in there and start doing some investigation on it. So again, here are the resources that I provided for you early on in our afternoon together. National Child Traumatic Stress Network, a lot of great resources there. This presentation and some of the conversation in the presentation are directly from some of these sources. National Child Traumatic Stress Initiative as well. The Child Trauma Academy, and if all else fails, check out the CDC Adverse Childhood Experiences. They probably have more resources than any of these other resources that are on the screen combined. So CDC's website, check those resources out. In addition to that, if you're having questions that are sort of related to figuring the tool out in practice, you can ask folks within our CANS New York Technical Assistance Institute for a helping hand. Here you see our regional map. We do have coaches all across the state that are willing and able to do case reviews, willing to help you get certified, willing to provide tip sheets and other resources that'll help you be successful. And just general coaching, whatever it is that you need, there is a resource, okay? So visit us, visit our website, www.cansnyinstitute.org. I can place that into the chat box as well, www.cansnyinstitute, sorry, I have sausage fingers, .org. So you can check our site out at the link that I just placed in there. Before I run, what I will do is I will also provide you guys with a brief evaluation. I would love if you could fill out the evaluation, give us some feedback, give us some topics and some ideas some other ideas that perhaps you want to cover in a different lunch and learn session. We are totally open to that.